The fluorescent lights of the National Museum of Natural History's basement archives hummed with their familiar 60 Hz drone as Dr. Sarah Chen watched the Aria 7 robotic unit navigate between towering shelves of specimen boxes. It was 3:47 a.m. on October 15, 2024, and she should have been home in her Arlington apartment, but the grant deadline for her digitization project loomed like a storm cloud. The robot, a sleek chrome and black machine about the size of a shopping cart, moved with mechanical precision through the labyrinthine storage areas that most visitors never saw, the hidden arteries of America's attic. Chen pressed her palm against her coffee mug, savoring the warmth seeping through the ceramic. The basement always felt cold, even in October, as if the weight of 7 floors above pressed all the heat from the air. She'd been working on the Smithsonian's massive digitization initiative for 18 months, cataloging millions of items that had been gathering dust in storage for decades. Tonight, Aria 7 was scanning through Section M47, a particularly cluttered area that hadn't been properly inventoried since the Carter administration. The robot's sensors beeped twice, an anomaly alert. Chen looked up from her laptop, where she'd been reviewing metadata for a collection of Civil War-era medical instruments. On her monitor, Area 7's feed showed something unusual. A section of wall that didn't match the architectural blueprints in the system. The robot's LiDAR had detected a void approximately 8 feet wide and 12 feet deep, hidden behind what appeared to be a false wall constructed sometime in the late 1970s. "What the hell?" Chen muttered, setting down her mug. The Smithsonian's basement was a maze of additions and modifications built over more than a century, but this was different. The construction looked hastily done, almost crude compared to the institution's usual meticulous standards. She grabbed her tablet and headed down the narrow corridor, following the robot's blinking navigation lights. The smell hit her first, a musty, closed-up odor that spoke of decades without air circulation. Aria 7 had positioned itself in front of a section of drywall that looked newer than the surrounding stone and brick. Chen ran her fingers along the edges, feeling where the wall had been fitted against the original masonry. The workmanship was sloppy, with visible gaps filled with what looked like quick-setting compound. She pulled out her phone and dialed the security office. "Hey, Mike. It's Sarah in the archives. I need someone from maintenance down here. Aria 7 found something weird in M47. Mike Rodriguez had been working nights at the museum for 15 years, and his voice carried the weary patience of someone accustomed to false alarms. "What kind of weird, Doc?" "There's a sealed room down here that's not on any blueprint. Looks like it was walled off in the 70s or 80s. A pause. "You sure about that?" "I mean, there's a lot of storage modifications over the years." Chen pressed her ear to the wall. "I'm sure. Can you bring a sledgehammer?" 20 minutes later, Rodriguez appeared with a maintenance cart loaded with tools. He was a compact man in his 50s with calloused hands and the kind of methodical approach that came from decades of solving other people's problems. "This better not be some kind of treasure hunt thing," he said, though Chen could tell he was curious despite himself. "Just help me get through this wall." Chen had already used a stud finder to locate the wall's frame. "There's definitely a space behind here, and it's not supposed to exist." The first swing of the sledgehammer sent vibrations through the floor. The drywall cracked but held. 3 more swings opened a hole large enough for a flashlight beam. Chen peered through and immediately stepped back, her heart hammering. "Mike, we need to call the police." "What? Why?" Rodriguez moved to look through the hole himself. The flashlight beam revealed a small room, maybe 8 by 12 feet, with concrete walls and a single metal folding table. On the table sat a stack of yellowed papers, a few personal items, and what looked like children's lunchboxes. The air that escaped through the hole carried the scent of old paper and something else, something that made Chen's stomach clench. Because this looks like a crime scene. By 6 a.m., the basement corridor buzzed with activity. Detective Marcus Webb of the Metropolitan Police Department's Cold Case Unit had arrived with a forensics team, transforming the quiet archives into something resembling a television crime drama. Webb was a tall black man in his early 40s, with graying temples and the kind of steady presence that came from 20 years of seeing humanity's worst impulses. Chen waited in the hallway, nursing her fourth cup of coffee and watching the controlled chaos. The forensics photographer's flash illuminated the hidden room in stark bursts, casting dramatic shadows on the walls. She'd been questioned twice already, first by a uniformed officer, and then by Webb himself, who'd taken detailed notes about the robot's discovery and the wall's construction. "Dr. Chen," Webb approached with a manila folder tucked under his arm, "I need to ask you about the museum's records. Specifically, anything about construction or modifications to this area in the late 1970s. Chen nodded, grateful to have something to focus on besides the growing knot in her stomach. "I can access the facility's database. What exactly are you looking for?" "Well, we've got a problem." Webb opened the folder, revealing several evidence bags. "The lunchboxes in there? They have names on them. Tommy Chen. No relation, I assume. Maria Santos, David Kim, Jennifer Walsh, and about 15 others, all dated May 12, 1978. The coffee cup slipped from Chen's hands, shattering on the concrete floor. May 12, 1978. That's a Thursday. According to the school records we pulled, PS 186 in Queens had a 5th grade class visit the museum that day. 23 students, 2 teachers, and 3 parent chaperones. Webb's voice carried the weight of someone delivering news that would change everything. None of them were ever seen again. Chen felt the walls of the corridor pressing in around her. She'd heard whispers about the Smithsonian Incident Museum staff occasionally mentioned it in the same breath as other urban legends and unsolved mysteries, but she'd always assumed it was just that. A story that had grown in the telling, like the supposed curse of the Hope Diamond or the phantom footsteps in the castle building. "That's impossible," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't. 28 people can't just vanish from the Smithsonian. There would be records, investigations, news coverage. There were all of those things. Webb said quietly, "The case files take up 6 boxes in our basement. It was the biggest missing persons case in D.C. history until 9/11. Every federal agency you can think of got involved. FBI, Secret Service, even the CIA. The museum was closed for 2 weeks while they searched every inch of the building. And they never found anything. Not a trace. Until now." Webb gestured toward the hidden room. "We found personal items belonging to all 28 victims in there. Lunchboxes, backpacks, a teacher's purse, even a parent's wallet. But no bodies. No signs of struggle. No indication of what happened to them." Chen slumped against the wall, her mind reeling. Who would do something like this? And why? "That's what we need to find out." Webb closed the folder. "I'm going to need access to all the museum's records from that period. Personnel files, construction permits, security logs, visitor records, everything. This isn't just a missing persons case anymore. It's a homicide investigation." The next few hours blurred together in a haze of bureaucratic procedures and emotional shock. Chen found herself in the role of liaison between the police and the museum administration, helping to navigate the complex web of federal oversight and institutional protocols that governed the Smithsonian. Dr. Margaret Winters, the museum's director, had been roused from her home in Chevy Chase and arrived looking like she'd aged 10 years in the drive downtown. 46 years, Winters said, standing in her office overlooking the National Mall. For 46 years, these families had been wondering what happened to their children, their teachers, their parents. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of composed demeanor that came from decades of handling crises, but Chen could see the strain in her eyes. "The media is going to have a field day with this," Chen said, watching through the window as news vans began gathering on the mall. Somehow, despite the early hour and the attempt to keep the discovery quiet, word had leaked. The story was already trending on social media. #Smithsonian vanishing, #Cold Case 1978, #Missing Class. "Let them," Winters said. "Those families deserve answers. They've waited long enough." Webb knocked on the office door and entered without waiting for permission. "We need to talk about the room's construction. According to the forensics team, That wall was built within days of the disappearance, probably the same week. That's impossible, Winters said. Every construction project requires multiple approvals, contractor vetting, safety inspections. You can't just seal off a room in a federal building without leaving a paper trail. Unless you're someone with access and authority, Webb said. Someone who could work after hours, who knew the building's layout, who had keys and security codes. He paused. We need a list of everyone who worked at the museum in May 1978. Everyone with access to the basement levels. Chen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. You think someone who worked here was involved? I think someone who worked here knows what happened to those kids, Webb said. And they've been keeping that secret for 46 years. The archives became Chen's second home over the next 3 days. She'd requisitioned a corner desk in the basement, surrounded by boxes of files dating back to the 1970s. The Aria 7 robot had been reassigned to help with the search, its sensors now calibrated to detect any other hidden spaces in the building. So far, they'd found nothing but the usual detritus of institutional life: forgotten storage closets, abandoned equipment, and the occasional mouse nest. The personnel files made for grim reading. In May 1978, the museum had employed 847 people across all departments, from renowned scientists to maintenance staff. Any of them could have had access to the basement during off hours, and many would have known about the construction materials stored in the sub-basement. The list of potential suspects was overwhelming. Chen's phone buzzed with a text from her sister in San Francisco. Saw the news. Are you okay? This is insane. She'd been getting messages like this all day. Friends and family expressing concern and morbid curiosity in equal measure. The story had exploded across social media, spawning conspiracy theories and amateur detective work that ranged from plausible to absurd. Found something, Webb said, appearing at her desk with a thick folder. The missing class wasn't supposed to be here on May 12th. Their original field trip was scheduled for May 19th, but it got moved up a week because of a conflict with standardized testing. Chen looked up from the employee records she'd been reviewing. So it was a last-minute change? Very last minute. The school called the museum's education department on May 10th to request the change. That's a Thursday, requesting a change for the following Tuesday. Webb sat on the edge of her desk. Who would have known about that change? The education department, obviously. Probably security so they could adjust the visitor count. Maybe facilities. If they needed to set up special displays. Chen felt pieces clicking together in her mind. And anyone who had access to the scheduling system. In 1978, that would have been a pretty small group. We're talking about paper scheduling books, not computer databases. Webb opened the folder. I've got the education department staff from that period. 6 people, including the director. Chen scanned the list. Most of the names meant nothing to her, but one stood out. Dr. Harold Everett, Associate Director of Educational Programs. I know that name. He's mentioned in several of the construction documents I've been reviewing. What kind of construction documents? Nothing major, mostly routine maintenance requests, updates to electrical systems, that sort of thing. Chen pulled up the relevant files on her laptop. But he seems to have been involved in a lot of basement-level work. Look at this. He requested access to the sub-basement storage areas multiple times in the spring of 1978. Webb leaned over her shoulder to read the screen. What was he looking for down there? According to these work orders, he was investigating humidity control issues in the education materials storage area. Chen scrolled through the documents. But here's the weird part. The facilities department has no record of any humidity problems in that area. I checked with the current staff, and they said the environmental controls in that section have been stable for decades. So he was lying about why he needed access. Or he was looking for something specific. Chen clicked through to another document. This is interesting. 3 days after the disappearance, Everett submitted a request for emergency construction work in the basement. Says here it was for urgent repairs to a damaged load-bearing wall. Webb's expression darkened. The wall that sealed off the room? Has to be. And look at this. The work order was approved and completed the same day. No oversight, no inspection, no questions asked. Chen felt sick. He hid that room. and he had the authority to do it without anyone questioning him. We need to find Harold Everett. The search for Dr. Harold Everett proved more challenging than expected. According to the personnel records, he'd resigned from the Smithsonian in August 1978, 3 months after the disappearance. His resignation letter was brief and professional, citing, quote, personal reasons and new opportunities in the private sector. There was no forwarding address, no indication of where he might have gone. Webb had put his team on the case, running Everett's name through every database they could access. The results were frustrating. Harold Everett seemed to have vanished as completely as the missing class. No death certificate, no Social Security records after 1978, no property ownership, no credit history. It was as if he'd simply ceased to exist. People don't just disappear, Webb said, pacing around Chen's makeshift office. Not in 1978, not now. There's always a trail, taxes, medical records, something. Chen was deep in the museum's archives, following a different lead. What if he didn't disappear? What if he changed his name? You mean witness protection? Or just a legal name change? It was easier to do back then, especially if you moved to a different state. She pulled up a file on her laptop. I've been looking at the Education Department's organizational structure in 1978. Everett reported to Dr. Patricia Hawthorne, who was the director of the entire education program. Is she still alive? Retired in 1995. Lives in a senior community in Bethesda. I called her this morning. Chen hesitated. She didn't want to talk about Everett. Said it was ancient history and hung up on me. Webb stopped pacing. That's not the reaction of someone who has nothing to hide. No, it's not. Chen saved her work and closed the laptop. I think we need to pay Dr. Hawthorne a visit. The Sunrise Manor Senior Living Community sat on a tree-lined street in Bethesda, Maryland. Its red brick facade and manicured gardens, projecting an image of comfortable retirement. Chen felt out of place walking through the lobby with its floral wallpaper and classical music. But Webb seemed at ease. He'd dealt with reluctant elderly witnesses before. Dr. Patricia Hawthorne was 86 years old, a small woman with carefully styled white hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She received them in the community room, a space filled with overstuffed chairs and the scent of fresh coffee. Other residents watched curiously from nearby tables, pretending to read newspapers while listening to the conversation. I told the young woman on the phone that I don't want to discuss Harold Everett, Hawthorne said without preamble. That was a long time ago, and I see no reason to dredge up old unpleasantness. Dr. Hawthorne, Webb said gently, we're investigating the disappearance of 28 people. Children and adults who vanished from the museum in 1978. We have reason to believe Dr. Everett was involved. Hawthorne's composure cracked slightly. Harold wasn't. He couldn't have hurt anyone. He was a brilliant educator, devoted to the children who visited the museum. But something happened, Chen said. Something that made him resign abruptly and disappear. We need to understand what that was. The old woman was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Harold was troubled. He'd been having problems for months before the incident. Personal problems. What kind of problems? His marriage was falling apart. His wife had filed for divorce, and she was seeking custody of their daughter. Harold was unstable. He'd been drinking heavily, showing up late to work, making strange comments about the children who visited the museum. Webb leaned forward. Strange how? He would watch them during the tours, follow them around the exhibits. Some of the other staff complained that he was making the children uncomfortable. Hawthorne's eyes filled with tears. I should have done something. I should have reported him, or at least removed him from direct contact with visitors. Did you know about his requests for basement access? I knew Harold had been spending time in the basement, but I thought he was just avoiding his responsibilities upstairs. I never imagined. She trailed off. Dr. Hawthorne, Chen said gently, do you know where Harold went after he left the museum? The old woman nodded slowly. He came to see me before he left. Said he was moving to Florida. Starting over. He gave me an address in Tampa, asked me to forward any mail. Do you still have that address? I might. I kept a lot of old files in my basement. If you give me a few days, I can look for it. Webb handed her his card. Dr. Hawthorne, this is important. Those families have been waiting for answers for 46 years. I know, she said, tears flowing freely now. I've thought about those poor children every day since it happened. Every single day. The address in Tampa led to a dead end, literally. The house had been demolished in 1995 to make way for a strip mall, and the property management company had no records of tenants from the 1970s. But the lead had given Webb's team a starting point, and they were able to trace Harold Everett's movements through Florida's public records. In 1979, Harold Everett had legally changed his name to Henry Edmonds. He'd purchased a small house in St. Petersburg and taken a job at a local elementary school. The pattern was disturbing. A man fleeing from accusations of inappropriate behavior with children, only to put himself in a position to have access to more children. He worked at Pinewood Elementary for 3 years, Webb said, reviewing the file in Chen's basement office. Then he moved to Jacksonville, took another teaching job under the same name. After that, the trail goes cold again. Chen felt a chill reading the man's employment history. How many schools? How many children? We don't know yet. I've got people calling school districts across Florida, but it's slow going. A lot of records from the 70s and 80s have been destroyed or lost. Webb closed the file. But I've got a feeling we're going to find more victims. The break came 3 days later, from an unexpected source. Chen was reviewing personnel files when her phone rang. The caller identified himself as David Kim, a name that made her stomach lurch. I'm calling about the news stories, he said. About the missing class from 1978. I think I need to tell you something. Chen's hands shook as she wrote down the details. David Kim was 44 years old, a software engineer living in Seattle. He'd been 10 years old in 1978, a fifth grader at PS 186 in Queens. He was supposed to have been on the field trip to the Smithsonian. I was sick that day, he said. I had a fever and my mom wouldn't let me go. I remember being so upset because I'd been looking forward to it for weeks. His voice was tight with emotion. All my friends were going. Tommy Chen, Maria Santos, Jenny Walsh. I never saw any of them again. Mr. Kim, Chen said carefully, do you remember anything unusual about the trip? Any changes to the schedule or the arrangements? Actually, yeah. The trip was originally supposed to be the following week, but they moved it up. Something about testing conflicts, I think. And there was something else. He paused. There was a man who came to our class a few days before the trip. He said he was from the museum, that he was going to be our special guide. Chen felt her heart racing. Can you describe him? Tall, thin, probably in his 30s. He had dark hair and wore glasses. I remember he seemed really excited about showing us around the museum. He kept talking about special exhibits that weren't open to the public. Do you remember his name? Dr. Everett. He said we should call him Dr. Harold. The phone call changed everything. Webb immediately contacted the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, and within hours, a team of federal agents had joined the investigation. The case had evolved from a cold case to an active manhunt, with the assumption that Harold Everett, now Henry Edmonds, was still alive and potentially still dangerous. Chen found herself at the center of a media storm. The story of the missing class had captured national attention, with cable news programs running hourly updates and social media buzzing with theories and speculation. The families of the missing children, now middle-aged themselves, were speaking out for the first time in decades. It's been 46 years, said Patricia Santos, Maria's older sister, in a tearful interview with CNN. 46 years of not knowing what happened to my little sister. Of wondering if she's still alive somewhere, if she's been hurt, if she's been... She couldn't finish the sentence. The psychological impact on the families was devastating. These were people who had spent nearly half a century in limbo, unable to grieve properly because they didn't know if their loved ones were dead or alive. Some had held on to hope that their children were still out there somewhere, living different lives. Others had accepted that they were probably dead but had never had the closure of knowing how or why. Chen watched the interviews from her hotel room, feeling the weight of her accidental discovery. The hidden room had been sealed for 46 years, and she had been the one to break it open. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd unleashed something that should have stayed buried. Her phone rang. It was Webb, calling from the FBI field office where he'd been working with the federal agents. "We found him," he said without preamble. "Henry Edmonds, formerly Harold Everett. He's been living in a retirement community in Sarasota, Florida, under his assumed name." Is he still alive?" "Very much so. 84 years old, in good health. The agents are on their way to arrest him now." Chen felt a mixture of relief and dread. "Do you think he'll tell us what happened to the children?" "I don't know," Webb said. "But we're going to find out." The arrest of Henry Edmonds made headlines around the world. The image of the elderly man being led away in handcuffs from the upscale retirement community where he'd been living seemed to encapsulate the bizarre nature of the case. For 46 years, while families grieved and investigators searched, the man responsible had been living a quiet life in Florida, playing bridge and tending to his garden. The initial interrogation was handled by FBI agents with decades of experience in child abduction cases. Edmonds, who had reverted to his original name after the arrest, seemed almost relieved to finally be caught. He requested a lawyer but indicated that he was willing to talk about what had happened in 1978. Chen watched the interrogation through a one-way mirror, her stomach churning as the story slowly emerged. Everett's lawyer, a middle-aged woman named Janet Morrison, had advised him to cooperate fully in exchange for a plea agreement that would take the death penalty off the table. "It wasn't supposed to happen the way it did," Everett said, his voice barely audible in the small interrogation room. "I never intended to hurt anyone." "But you did hurt them," said Special Agent Lisa Rodriguez, the lead FBI interrogator. 28 people disappeared under your watch. Where are they, Harold?" Everett's hands trembled as he reached for a cup of water. "They're gone. They've been gone for 46 years. "Gone where? What did you do to them?" I can't." Everett broke down, sobbing into his hands. "I can't say it. I can't make it real again." The interrogation continued for hours, with Everett providing fragments of information between emotional breakdowns. Slowly, a picture emerged of a man who had been spiraling out of control in the spring of 1978, consumed by personal problems and an unhealthy obsession with the children who visited the museum. He admits to luring the class to the basement, Agent Rodriguez told the assembled investigators later. Says he told them he was going to show them something special, something that wasn't on the regular tour. "And then what?" Webb asked. "He won't say. Claims he can't remember exactly what happened next. Says it's all fuzzy and confusing." Chen felt sick. "He's lying. You don't forget something like that." "Of course he's lying," Rodriguez said. "But he's also 84 years old and clearly has some cognitive issues. We may never get the full truth." The partial confession was enough to charge Everett with kidnapping and murder, but it wasn't enough to provide closure for the families. The location of the bodies remained unknown, and Everett's claims of memory loss made it impossible to determine exactly what had happened in the basement of the Smithsonian on May 12, 1978. The investigation took a new turn when the FBI's evidence response team made another discovery in the museum's basement. Using ground-penetrating radar, they had detected anomalies in the concrete floor near the hidden room. When they broke through the floor, they found something that made even experienced investigators sick. Chen wasn't allowed to see the discovery firsthand, but Webb described it to her later, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "It's a mass grave. All 28 victims, buried in a concrete tomb beneath the museum floor." The revelation sent shockwaves through the already reeling community. The idea that the missing children and adults had been buried beneath one of America's most beloved institutions was almost too horrible to comprehend. Protesters gathered outside the museum, demanding answers and accountability. How could this happen, asked Patricia Santos at a press conference, her voice breaking. How could someone murder 28 people in the basement of the Smithsonian and get away with it for 46 years? It was a question that haunted everyone involved in the case. The investigation revealed a series of institutional failures and oversights that had allowed Everett to operate with impunity. The museum's security systems in 1978 were primitive by modern standards, and the basement levels were largely unsupervised. Everett had been able to lead the class to the isolated storage area without anyone noticing or questioning his actions. The man was a predator, Dr. Winters said at her own press conference. He exploited his position of trust and authority to commit an unthinkable crime. The Smithsonian Institution takes full responsibility for the failures that allowed this to happen. The forensic examination of the remains would take months, but preliminary results confirmed what everyone already knew. The victims had been killed shortly after their disappearance, and their bodies had been sealed in the concrete tomb that same week. The cause of death appeared to be carbon monoxide poisoning, suggesting that Everett had used some kind of gas to kill them. It would have been relatively quick, the medical examiner told the families at a private briefing. They probably lost consciousness within minutes. It was small comfort to people who had spent decades wondering if their loved ones had suffered, but it was something. The families began making funeral arrangements, finally able to lay their children and relatives to rest after 46 years of uncertainty. The psychological impact of the case extended far beyond the immediate families. The staff at the Smithsonian was devastated by the revelation that their beloved institution had been the site of such a horrific crime. Many employees struggled with the knowledge that they had been working directly above a mass grave for decades. Chen found herself in therapy, trying to process the trauma of her discovery. She'd gone from being a quietly dedicated archivist to being the person who had uncovered one of the most shocking crimes in American history. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. I keep thinking about all the times I walked through that basement, she told Dr. Amanda Foster, the therapist she'd started seeing after the arrest. All the times I stood right over their graves without knowing it. How could I not have felt something? How could I not have known? You couldn't have known, Dr. Foster said gently. You were doing your job, trying to preserve history. You couldn't have imagined that you were standing on top of such a terrible secret. But I should have. Those children, their families, they deserved better than to be forgotten in a basement. They weren't forgotten. You found them. You brought them home. The trial of Harold Everett began 8 months after his arrest in a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. The media circus was unprecedented, with reporters from around the world covering every development. The families of the victims sat in the front rows, finally facing the man who had destroyed their lives. Everett had aged visibly since his arrest, his once sharp blue eyes now clouded with what his defense attorney claimed was dementia. He sat quietly at the defense table, occasionally muttering to himself or staring blankly at the ceiling. The prosecution argued that his apparent confusion was an act, designed to avoid responsibility for his crimes. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, said federal prosecutor Michael Chen, no relation to Sarah, the defendant would have you believe that he's a frail, confused old man who can barely remember what he had for breakfast. But the evidence will show that Harold Everett is a calculating predator who spent months planning one of the most heinous crimes in American history. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented evidence of Everett's deteriorating mental state in the spring of 1978, his inappropriate behavior toward children, and his deliberate manipulation of the field trip schedule. They showed how he had used his position of authority to isolate the victims and lead them to their deaths. The defense, led by Janet Morrison, argued that Everett was severely mentally ill and had been for decades. They presented evidence of his history of depression, alcoholism, and possible dissociative episodes. They claimed that he had no clear memory of the events of May 12, 1978, and that his actions were the result of a complete psychological break. My client is not a monster, Morrison said in her opening statement. He is a deeply troubled man who suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown that resulted in an unthinkable tragedy. He has lived with the horror of what he did for 46 years, and he is prepared to face the consequences of his actions. The testimony was harrowing. Survivors like David Kim described the charismatic teacher who had visited their classroom, promising them a special adventure at the museum. Museum employees from 1978 testified about Everett's strange behavior in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Forensic experts described the methodical way in which the victims had been killed and their bodies concealed. Chen was called to testify about her discovery of the hidden room. She described the routine nature of the archive work, the robot's detection of the anomaly, and the moment when she first peered through the hole in the wall. The courtroom was silent as she spoke, the weight of 46 years of secrets filling the air. "Did you have any idea what you were about to discover?" the prosecutor asked. "No," Chen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought maybe it was just old storage or forgotten equipment. I never could have imagined what was really there." The most difficult testimony came from the families of the victims. Patricia Santos, now in her 60s, described the agony of not knowing what had happened to her 10-year-old sister. She talked about the false hopes and crushing disappointments, the way the mystery had consumed her family for decades. "We never stopped looking for Maria," she said, tears streaming down her face. "We never stopped hoping that she would come home. Even when everyone else gave up, we kept believing that somewhere, somehow, she was still alive." Robert Walsh, Jennifer's father, was now 83 years old and in failing health. He had to be helped to the witness stand, his voice weak but determined. "I've waited 46 years to look this man in the eye," he said, staring directly at Everett. 46 years to ask him why he took my little girl away from me." Everett showed no visible reaction to the testimony, continuing to stare blankly ahead or mumble to himself. The prosecution argued that his apparent detachment was evidence of his cold, calculating nature. The defense claimed it was proof of his mental illness. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Everett was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that carried little practical meaning for an 84-year-old man in failing health. "Justice has finally been served," said Patricia Santos outside the courthouse. "It took 46 years, but Harold Everett will never hurt another child." The case had far-reaching consequences beyond the courtroom. The Smithsonian Institution implemented sweeping security reforms, including comprehensive background checks for all employees and volunteers, enhanced surveillance systems, and stricter protocols for school visits. The museum also established a memorial garden on the National Mall, dedicated to the memory of the 28 victims. Chen left the Smithsonian shortly after the trial, unable to continue working in the building where she had made such a horrific discovery. She took a position at the Library of Congress, where she could continue her archival work without the constant reminder of what she had found in the basement. The families of the victims finally held funeral services for their loved ones 4 decades after their deaths. The services were attended by hundreds of people, including many who had followed the case in the media and felt compelled to pay their respects. The children were buried in a special section of Arlington National Cemetery, their graves marked with simple headstones that bore their names and the dates of their lives. Dr. Patricia Hawthorne, Harold Everett's former supervisor, died 3 months after the trial. Her family said she had never recovered from the guilt of not recognizing the warning signs of Everett's mental state. In her final interview, she had said, "I should have seen it coming. I should have protected those children." The case spawned numerous books, documentaries, and academic studies, examining how such a crime could have been committed and concealed for so long. Security experts studied the institutional failures that had allowed Everett to operate undetected, while psychologists analyzed the warning signs that had been missed. "This case represents a perfect storm of institutional failure and individual pathology," wrote Dr. James Harrison, a criminologist at Georgetown University. "It shows how a determined predator can exploit systemic weaknesses to commit unthinkable crimes." The Aria 7 robot that had made the initial discovery was retired from service and placed in the Smithsonian's collection, a reminder of how technology had finally brought justice to the victims. The hidden room in the basement was sealed with concrete and marked with a small plaque commemorating the victims. 5 years after the discovery, Chen returned to the museum for the first time since leaving her position. She stood in the main hall, watching families with young children explore the exhibits, their faces filled with wonder and curiosity. The sight brought tears to her eyes, but also a sense of peace. "They're safe now," she whispered to herself. The children are safe. The case of the missing fifth-grade class had finally been closed, but its impact would be felt for generations. The families had their answers, the victims had their justice, and the institution had learned from its failures. It was a resolution that came 46 years too late, but it was a resolution nonetheless. Harold Everett died in prison 18 months after his conviction, taking with him whatever remaining secrets he might have harbored. His death was noted briefly in the media, but it was the victims who were remembered. 28 people who had gone on what should have been an exciting educational adventure and never returned home. The Memorial Garden on the National Mall became a place of pilgrimage for families who had lost children, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, the truth could eventually emerge. The names of the victims were etched in granite, ensuring that they would never be forgotten again. Sarah Chin continued her archival work at the Library of Congress, but she never forgot the lesson of that night in the Smithsonian basement. Sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones we never expected to make, and sometimes the greatest service we can provide is to give voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. The case remained a touchstone for investigators and families of missing persons, proof that even after decades, answers were still possible. Cold cases around the country were reopened with renewed vigor, inspired by the knowledge that time doesn't always heal all wounds. Sometimes it just buries them deeper. In the end, the story of the missing fifth-grade class was a testament to the persistence of truth and the power of technology to illuminate even the darkest corners of human experience. It was a reminder that justice, however delayed, was still worth pursuing, and that every victim deserved to be remembered, honored, and finally brought home.